So I hear you're from Iran. How do you like it here so far?
It's different. I thought people who'd have this much freedom would be happy, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
It's really interesting that you'd say that because I definitely agree.
It would seem that people given greater freedom would be different, but I see how men treat women and how women allow themselves to be treated in this country, and it feels like I never left my own.
I completely agree with what you're saying, believe me. I was the king of taking things for granted. You wouldn't think it now, but I dropped out of high school 3 different times, ended up in a mental institution because I was trying to kill myself. Why? All because I was chasing social status.
I could never imagine you that way.
Thanks, but the point is that with all the rights and freedoms that we have in this country, you have to wonder why things turn out this way. From what I've come across, I think that the difference between where you're from and here is that you are bound by laws and religion, whereas here we're bound by ideas. Ideas that are conveyed in popular culture and the mass media.
I'm not familiar with this, so I wouldn't know.
I see. Well, did you watch the movie?
Yes.
Then we'd better get researching because one of us is going to have to present this. So what'd you think about the film?
Well, I was fascinated. I never heard of secret gospels that told a side to Jesus that was not widely known. And if it's true what is said in the film, then this information could really threaten what so many have believed for so long.
You're right. And the interesting thing is that this newly revealed history doesn't deny that Christ existed, but much rather explains that he did, but as a mere mortal. And that the early church covered up the truth that Christ in fact worshipped the goddess and experienced this through hieros gamos, or ritual sex magic.
I remember hearing that in the film, but I didn't understand what it meant. Could you elaborate for me?
Hieros gamos is practiced having a group of people surrounding 2 individuals, a couple who's engaged in the act of having sex. The point is that while the group chants and the man is at the point of orgasm, he removes himself from all thought and reasoning and is supposed to have a certain supernatural experience where then and only then he's able to rise to a certain level of divinity and achieve gnosis, which is the Greek word for knowledge, and in effect commune with God. The problem that's posed in the book and the film, though, is that the church, wanting to remain the sole conduit to God and desiring to retain a political power over the people, supposedly recast the idea of sex as a shameful act. But the answer to that issue is a bit complex. What I've observed through my research is that the early church was responding to cultural concerns. Much like Paul the Apostle in the New Testament had to respond to a man in the church having sex with his stepmom. So the church fathers and leaders at the time indeed did condemn illicit and promiscuous sex practiced by the pagan religions, and even did have mixed thoughts on certain situations, being that many were unique. But who wouldn't be concerned when you're the one looked to care for the well-being of an entire community? So I can understand mixed opinions throughout church history on this subject. To me, that's natural. The interesting thing, though, is that the Bible actually affirms sexual activity with one's spouse in a way that is surprisingly positive between husband and wife, but it encourages it to be done in moderation and in a way as to not misuse each other's bodies for what they weren't intended.
Wow, you really know what you're talking about.
By the time we're done sifting through all this information, we'll both realize that these ideas are more prevalent in this society than most people imagine.
Okay, so if you don't mind, I would like to reiterate what you're saying here and pose the next question.
For sure.
Okay, so I understand the idea that there are these 2 histories about Jesus. One refers to him as a mere mortal and a person who practiced ritual sex magic and in effect conveyed worshipping goddess of pagan religions. While on the other hand, you have this Jesus who never had a wife and was actually resurrected from the dead and wrongfully charged and crucified. Now, I couldn't tell this to my parents who still live in Iran, but personally I felt that women should have had more respect in my country. That being the case, I have a bit of a problem with the idea that women were used as mere vessels to experience union with God by the use of their bodies as a mere sexual object in this hieros gamos. I wouldn't really feel comfortable with people watching me having sex and chanting while I'm doing it. I think that makes the situation all the more disrespectful. So although I don't agree with this hero's gamu, I grew up in a Muslim family and I was taught that Christianity was not the truth. And in the film actually said that the divinity of Christ was decided by a close vote of the Council of Nicaea. So are they both wrong?
So it turns out that there was in fact a council where the divinity of Christ was voted on. But it would seem there is far more to it than what the film would propose. From what I know, councils were not uncommon in biblical times. Even the Greeks would have public symposiums where a crowd of concerned individuals would gather proposing new ideas and together as a community come to conclusions. Paul the Apostle is shown to be involved in such events in the book The Acts of the Apostles. Let's read this excerpt from an author I found on the subject. This historian explains this particular council in question like this.
Councils were important in order to maintain an orthodox faith and prevent the spread of false teaching. One such false teaching was being spread by Arius in AD 318. Arius taught that Jesus was a created being just like other humans and was not the quote-unquote begotten Son of God. He was opposed by Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria, who declared Arius a heretic in a local council in AD 321. So Arius moved to Palestine and continued his teaching there. If he had kept his ideas to his own followers, there would have not been cause to call a council. But Arius began sending letters to area churches promoting the idea of Jesus as a created being. The debate grew over the next few years, finally gaining the attention of the Emperor Constantine.
Constantine, who had consolidated his hold on the Roman Empire, sought unity in all regions. He knew that a division within the Christian church would be one more destabilizing force in the empire, so he moved to restore peace. Constantine called together more than 300 bishops from around the empire, primarily from the east. This would have favored Arius' cause, as that is where his influence was greatest. Bishops traveled thousands of miles to attend the conference held in Constantinople. Many came bearing wounds and scars from torture they had endured for their faith.
The Arians submitted their statement of doctrine that flatly denied the divinity of Christ. It was soundly rejected. The bishops led by Athanasius considered what was taught by the original church in the writings of the New Testament. These men wrote up an alternative creed, which became the blueprint for the Nicene Creed. In it, Jesus was affirmed to be divine, the historic position of the church for the previous 300 years.
The new creed was adopted. Only 2 voted against, which can hardly be called a close vote. The church had suffered for 3 centuries under the tyranny of the Roman Empire. The Council of Nicaea came only 14 years after the final persecution of Christians at the hands of Emperor Galerius. The bishops of the church would never have compromised what had cost their fellow Christians so much. They would have rather suffered another 3 centuries of oppression and persecution than deny their Lord.
Yet, the Da Vinci Code makes this one of the most sublime theological legacies of the ancient church appear to be mere political propaganda. Even if Constantine's motives were not driven by his desire for correct doctrine, which no one knows it doesn't matter. The evidence of the history and the light of the scripture affirm the divinity of Christ. The apostles, the persecuted church, and the Nicene bishops did not revise history. They affirmed it. For them, it certainly was not the greatest story ever sold. Many paid for their faith with their own blood.
So, the church always believed that Jesus was divine, but it was a fringe sect that came along and proposed this new claim.
Why? Why would Dan Brown exaggerate the facts? For money or merely for muse? As I said, I'm not a Christian, but the fact that he would even meddle with these ideas discredits the lives that were lost due to the lack of freedom to worship, and to me disrespects the truth of history.
Sorry, but it's not over yet. In 1947, there were 52 Coptic scrolls found just outside of Egypt in Nag Hammadi. 5 were called Gospels. The group of a New Testament scholars called the Jesus Seminar, who've taken these scrolls and attempted to use them to redefine Jesus and all of Christianity. It turns out the one scroll they claim to be the second earliest Christian writing in existence is the Gospel of Thomas. Yet, interestingly enough, scholars who first began studying these scrolls didn't seem to believe that. They say the earliest it can be dated is 150 AD, whereas the Gospels contained in the Bible are agreed upon to all be earlier than 70 AD.
Then why would they conclude something like that? This is making me suspicious of the Jesus seminar.
Well, it turns out what they base their claim upon is what is sad to say the most bizarre scholarly claim I've ever heard in my entire life. There's this theoretic scroll called Q. It's a scroll that no one has ever seen and apparently only exists in the minds of these scholars. They observed identical portions of the Gospel of Matthew and Luke in the Bible that do not refer to the death and resurrection of Christ or his divinity. And they reason that there must have been an earlier text that they copied their writings from, which is quote unquote Q. Yet it's this non-existent scroll Q that scholars have used to turn an accepted history of 2,000 years upside down.
There has to be a deeper reason. Why would they conjure this stuff up?
Well, Adelit, that's where our observation of the nature of these two situations begins. Except from here on out, we're dealing with theological matters that require faith to even consider. But the observations are definitely interesting to consider. What I'm saying is when you look at the one side, you have the story of a people from the Bible who supposedly received their information and scriptures from God, whose name they call Yahweh, and whose son they call Jesus, and who they believe to have risen from the dead after being nailed to a cross for the sins of humanity, thus being divine. Where on the other hand, you have this Gnostic view of Jesus that hinges on a non-existent scroll from these Nag Hammadi texts that claim Jesus was not divine and actually mocks the name of Yahweh or the God of the Bible. In the 1970s, an occult Jesus, very like the Jesus of the Gnostic Gospels, is said to have channeled messages to an atheist psychologist who wrote them down and published them as this New Age text entitled A Course in Miracles. Listen to what this Jesus says, and I quote, "Do not make the pathetic error of clinging to the old rugged cross. Your only calling here is to devote yourself with active willingness to the denial of guilt in all its forms."
Well, that's completely different.
This is a far more recent account, but the central message of the Gnostic Gospel, along with its pagan practices, is contained in this one phrase. In the Gnostic text called the Apocryphon of James, again, another Jesus commanded his disciples, and I quote, "to be filled with the Spirit, but be lacking in reason or intellect." The idea is to rise to true salvation in gnosis when you realize that you're above any type of morality, and the idea of right and wrong becomes null and void. The point being is that
There are two sides to this coin. On one hand, you have a group of people who believe that freedom comes from denying our faults. On the other hand, you have a group of people who believe that freedom comes from confessing those faults and actually changing. On one hand, you have a group of people who are inspired to praise Yahweh and his son Jesus, where on the other hand, you have a group who's inspired to mock Yahweh and redefine his son as a mere man and a pagan. I come from a country where freedom for women is scarce and the freedom to worship is non-existent. I came to a country where women's rights are flourishing and religious diversity is encouraged. But I live in a reality where true freedom has to be discovered. I think I found my answer.